This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters. I'm Chris Hensley. The time is now 2 o'clock. I'm so used to saying 11 when we're live, but it's 2 o'clock here, Central Time in Houston. We have a fantastic guest for you today. The current conversation surrounding tech use among kids is focused largely on the negative, what not to do and what dangers to avoid. But EdTech educational tech expert Richard Culatta presents the flip side of the conversation in his forthcoming book, and this book just came out in July here, Digital for Good, Raising Kids to Thrive in an Online World. Uh, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Chris, it's a pleasure. Glad to talk to you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm gonna throw this out here as a parent of an 11-year-old who is in a really nice Montessori school here in Houston. One of the things that the school had focused on is like, well, we're not going to have technology until they reach elementary level, and so a year ago or 2 years ago we had some guidelines. Fast forward to COVID, and at any time during the day, all three of us can be glued to a screen. I think parents kind of have this. We're up in the air in this right now. Why did you write Digital for Good at this time?
Well, look, I'm also a parent, by the way. I have four kids between the ages of 8 and 16. I'm also dealing with a lot of these same things. But look, the main thing is I've spent my whole career looking at how technology can support learning. I've taught before. I worked for states. I worked for the federal government. I've worked in a variety of organizations, always around this focus of how can we use technology to support learning. What I was seeing was, as I was trying to help my own kids create the digital culture, if you will, that I wanted to have in my own home, I didn't have the answers to a lot of the questions, even though I'd spent my whole career looking at how to use technology effectively for learning. And as I went out to look at the books that were out there, a lot of what I saw was, again, very negative. It was things like, I mean, books that were called things like The Dumbest Generation, how tech is making kids, dumber. Things like, The Boogeyman in Your Kid's Pocket, how tech is going to destroy your family, right? But that wasn't what I was seeing when I was talking to other families, when I was talking to my kids. I'm seeing like incredibly smart, very engaged kids that need some help and support for using technology effectively, but it wasn't destroying them. It was actually helping them be more connected and more engaged with the rest of the world, though sometimes a little bit out of balance, right? Sometimes it was a little, there needed to be some limits. So I set out to write a book that said, hey, tech can actually be incredibly powerful to enrich your kids' life, to help them be productive learners, to help them be ready for their future careers. We don't need to, bury our devices in the sand in the backyard, but we do need to set up some boundaries and some healthy guidelines for how to use it well. And that's what I try to write in this book: how to be healthy users of technology, which actually does not mean, again, banning technology use. It just means providing some additional help and structure in our families.
So I definitely will piggyback on that I've gone from, oh, this is a bad thing, to my son's able to communicate with schoolmates that are out of state right now, and it's his only form of communication. So there's some very positive things there. Before we get into a lot of the positive things, you do write about something called digital dysfunction. Tell us a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, so even though I just said this is a very positive book and it sets it up in a positive way, but what I didn't want to do, and this is really important, is I'm not pretending that there aren't dangers and problems, right? It's not that there aren't dangers and problems. It's actually that we need to use a positive approach to get around those dangers and problems. And so I start the book by listing what I call our digital dysfunctions. And these are some real problems that we have to recognize as parents, as families. And they're things like the fact that we bombard our kids in online spaces with advertisements, and we don't prepare them to recognize what's an ad and what's not. I also talk about some of the dangers that we see in eroding democracy, right? When there are tools both from people within our own country, but also I talk about foreign actors that are actively trying to pull apart and dismantle our democracy through digital tools, right? And then there are some other things that I talk about, like the false baseline that can be created when we look at things online and everything online seems perfect. Or looking at I talk a little about just a huge pornography industry and how fake that is, right? It's not based on real healthy sexual relationships. And so that's also a dysfunction, because when we compare our life, whatever part of our life it is, to what we see online, we feel like we're not measuring up to that kind of fake, falsified baseline, and then that can lead to depression and some other real challenges. So those are some of the dysfunctions that we just have to be aware of, even as we try to create a better approach to creating healthy kids.
I love it, because we're definitely going to focus on the positive stuff, but having that framework that this is good for adults.
You can't ignore the risks, right? You got to know what they are, even if we're going
Right.
to focus on the positive.
But then that goes right into what you call digital citizenship. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
So I like the term digital citizenship, because what I'm getting at is, when we think about our role, our sort of our physical citizenship, if you will, our we are members of a physical community, whether that's our neighborhood where we live, the state that we live, the country that we live. We are part of a community, and there are things that come along with being part of a community in a physical space. We are expected to be kind to people around us. We're expected to help people that need a hand. We're expected to abide by certain rules as we're driving or going into public spaces. Those are all well established. We know what those are. We've been taught those since we were in kindergarten. But when we talk about digital spaces, we have not done as good of a job as defining what does it mean to be a digital citizen, meaning somebody who doesn't just show up and take from the digital space, but who's actually part of the community, who actually cares that our digital community is healthy, that's not there just for themselves, but that's there to help create an inclusive, safe space for those around us. And so that's why I like that term. It's the type of person we want to be when we're in a virtual space. That's digital citizenship.
I love it. I love it. And you go even further with that, and you mentioned this a little bit already about being balanced. What does it mean to be balanced when we're talking about the digital age and our kids?
Yeah, look, Chris, this is one of the ones that I hear from parents, probably more than anything, is how do we find balance in our lives with tech use? And what we often revert to is using the clock as a way to limit tech use. And so sometimes you'll hear about screen time, you have an hour of screen time, whatever. The problem, and by the way, I totally get why we do that, because we want to find balance. But there are problems when we use time as the limiting factor. One of the problems is it teaches kids that all of the things that we do in a virtual space are of the same value, right? You have an hour, do whatever you want, doesn't matter what you do, it's all the same value. When it stops at the end of an hour, it's over. That's not true, right? I think we could all agree that differing activities have very different values. If you're playing a game that is a luck-based game that you're just sort of repeating over and over again, 10 minutes is probably enough of that. If you're reading a book or talking to a friend, as you just mentioned your kid has done, those are activities that have greater value and maybe should have more time. And the context of what else is going on in your life changes too. So, if I'm on a long trip and I'm in the back of the car, the amount of time that I spend, even if it's just watching something or playing maybe more of a mindless game, right? We're going to be a little more flexible there. If it's a day when you're at home or you have something you're studying for school the next day, those digital activities need to change. So the point is, yes, we should have limits on activities, but it should not be based solely on the amount of time. Actually, let me give one more quick example of this. I often think about I compare things to food. I like eating, so I compare things to food a lot. And when we eat, we have meal times during the day, and we teach our kids that they should stop eating when they are full, right? When they are satisfied, they should know to stop eating, not when the timer runs out. And so imagine if we did the same thing that we do with screen time on devices for food, and you're like, okay, you have food time for the next hour. You can eat whatever, you can eat Twinkies, you can eat chips, you can eat whatever you want, but eat right up until the end of the hour, and that's where we'll stop you. No, right? Of course not. We're going to say you should eat until you're full, and you should not only eat junk. Maybe we get a little bit of a Twinkie in there for dessert, but we want to eat healthy foods. That's the approach that we need to take to finding limits to how we use our devices. And it's way more powerful than just using screen time.
I love it. I love it. I'm thinking of adults need these lessons too.
Oh,
You know, you spend 2 hours on Facebook versus getting stuff done online. We need to know these rules.
Chris, listen, let me tell you, I mean, my expertise is in working with young people, so that's where I wrote the book. But I will tell you, there are lessons that apply to people of all ages as you read through these ideas.
Well, you also talk about just staying informed. How does that filter to either the parent or the child when it comes to digital?
Yeah, so it's one of the most important things that we can do and teach our kids to do with devices is use them to be informed. And that doesn't mean just on like, news and that sort of things, but also just things that they're interested in, right? Skills that they want to learn, topics that they care about. But it is really important that we help them learn to see these devices that they have in their pockets as access to a huge wealth of information, right? They should think that this phone in their pocket to them should be a learning library even more than an entertainment device. But that it takes some skill, right? It's not as easy as we think just going online, right? There's so much information and a lot of information that is not helpful. And I talk about that even more than, fake news is one thing. We talk about fake news and watching for fake news, and of course we should, but that's just a little tip of the iceberg. There's lots of content that's not fake news per se, but just isn't helpful for what we're trying to do, right? A lot of it might be, advertising content or, stuff that's written with the purpose of trying to sell you something. That's not fake news, but it's not helpful if I'm trying to learn something that's, a new skill. The skill of recognizing useful information and knowing how to find useful information and knowing how to store and recall in digital spaces useful information is probably the most important skill that will determine our kids' success in future college, in future work. But those are the skills that we need to be teaching at a very young age if we want them to be able to be informed learners in a virtual space.
I love that. I love that. As a financial advisor by trade during the day,
Yeah.
one of the things that we're bombarded by is just noise. And so
Yes.
part of, my job is like limiting it down to what's really important. And so that's one of the things that you just mentioned is the child having the ability to know what useful information is, where to find it, where to recall it when needed. Very important skills.
And Chris, actually, let me build on that for a second, because when we were growing up, when you and I were growing up, our task to stay informed was finding information, right? Where can we get an answer? And when we would learn how to do that, I had an Encyclopedia Britannica set, right? Some of you may remember those. Now it's a very different problem, right? There's so much, as you said, we're just bombarded with information. The problem, and it is a problem, right? It is a challenge, is very different. Kids today need to learn filtering. How do you filter it out? How do you curate? That's the word I use in the book. How do you curate out of all of the noise the parts that are meaningful? And it's not that I don't think one is better or worse, how we grew up versus how they grew up, but it is different. And we have to recognize that the skills that you need to stay informed today are much more about how to find the useful stuff in all of the noise than for us, where it was just, hey, can we just actually get access to an answer? And if we can, then it's probably a pretty good one.
Yeah, going through a card catalog and learning the Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah, right. It was all of this stuff about how do you actually get to the answer, and now it's about how do you filter out all the noise that's not helpful, and then what you have left can be very useful.
Well, another thing, let's kind of sidestep here and talk about being inclusive.
Hmm.
This is one of the things you focus on is considering multiple viewpoints and how, how to respect. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So one of the tricky parts about our virtual world, it's a kind of a blessing and a curse, right? Is the providers, the tech providers that build the tools that we use, they have an incentive to keep us there as long as possible. And so they use very complex algorithms, and I talk about some in the book. They use complex algorithms in order to keep us staying, clicking and viewing ads on the site as long as we possibly can. They do that by showing us content that aligns with what we already believe. Now, the danger is we can start to feel like we are artificially right all the time, no matter what our belief is, right? I don't care. You tell me what my belief, it doesn't matter what it is. Whatever our belief, no matter how, mainstream or niche,
Yeah.
in a virtual space, we are going to start to feel like everyone around us believes what we believe, because the tools are putting us in this bubble. And so one of the most important things that we have to do and be teaching our kids is there is real value in hearing differing viewpoints, in hearing viewpoints on topics that are very different from ours. It doesn't mean that ours is now suddenly wrong. It doesn't even mean that I have to agree with you, but there is real important value in knowing that there are different viewpoints and that I'm not always right in everything that I'm thinking. And so that section that I wrote about being inclusive just reminds us how important it is to not only just be nice to people with other viewpoints, but we actually really need those different viewpoints, and we want to create a space, a safe space, an inclusive space where we can be hearing from different people and we can share where and how we agree and disagree on a variety of topics.
Wow, that's what you just said. It was very concise, but super important. And I feel people need to remember that there's strength in diversity and the fact that we are kind of sandwiched into this bubble with these algorithms. And like you said, being fed stuff to make, for us to see only one viewpoint coming out. And so that I think was a very important point that you just made. That leads us into our next section here, which is called being engaged.
Hmm.
And you talk about tech improving your relationship and your community. Tell us about that.
I love this part of it. This was actually my favorite part as I was writing is, we think about tech, especially for, with kids, as pulling them out of their world around them, right? And they get very focused on, playing a game over and over again. And certainly that can happen, right? As again, at the beginning of the book, I talk about digital dysfunctions. But what I loved seeing was all of the ways that technology can actually enhance the engagement between kids and their families and their communities and their country, right? There are some great ways to do it. And some examples that I give for communities, it's really powerful when a kid can, there are a bunch of apps that actually can help be engaged in the broader community, like some apps that can help kids find and donate their time, go and volunteer, right? It gives ideas for that. But there's also a whole series of apps that are kind of like crowdsourcing, if you will. And
Mm-hmm.
so one that I really like, there's an app called Billion Graves. And it's just a fun way that you can go into a cemetery and there's all these graves, right? Many of them are older. Many of them, you don't have it may be a little hard to read what's on there. And you may have a relative somewhere that's looking to find out where somebody was buried. They're doing their, they're looking at their family history, and that's not searchable, right? A tombstone is not searchable. And so there's this great app where you can go in and take a picture and you can just type in the information on the tombstone. And now all of a sudden, anybody who wants to find out where their relatives are buried, they can search and it comes back because you have digitized that artifact. And the
Wow.
Smithsonian does this. There's lots of different places that digitize old records. What a great way to help contribute to your community just by doing a fun activity, right? So those are a number of ways. But Chris, in addition to helping with your community, there are, let me give two other quick examples. One is kids' voice suddenly matters when they're online because they can participate in programs like change.org, or they can write to their elected leaders, and they can share things that are important to them. That, again, when we were kids growing up, we didn't, I mean, we could write a letter to our senator, I guess. I don't know if they ever actually read them, but that's very different than using their voice in the virtual world to help call attention to issues and problems that are important to them. And the last part that I'll share about being engaged is actually being engaged right at home with your own family. I loved, I think a lot of us saw this during COVID, how technology could be used for us to have engagements with our kids and other family members who we weren't getting to see very often. But it's also helpful for capturing family moments. So we have a deal with our kids. We have a contract that we have with our kids. And in exchange for having a device and being able to use our network, one of the deals that we have is that they will help us capture family moments. So they'll capture pictures when we're traveling. They have a little notepad on their phone where they'll write down funny things that a brother or sister said. And then periodically we'll go through and we'll look at all these great pictures, or we'll read the funny quotes that they've collected. Those are ways that they can help be more engaged with their family through the use of technology.
I love it. I love it. Those are fantastic ideas, not only for the kids to be a bigger part of the community, but even for their own family engagement there. And then the one of the last bullet points here when we talk about is staying alert, being aware of actions online. Tell us about that.
Right. So being alert, these are the things, this is probably the part that most people would think of when they say, how do you prepare your kid to be, safe in a virtual space, right? And so I talk about needing to be alert for things, right? Being alert for anybody who is asking or doing something in a virtual space that seems suspicious, right? There are, one tip that I give that I always share is, in our family, we have a rule that if you are using a digital device, a laptop, a phone, whatever it is, you should not have your door closed, because we don't want to, by thinking that you can go into a room and close the door, communicate to our kids that somehow they are now in a private space. Nothing that is happening in a digital device is private. That's okay. We just need to know that. We need to not pretend it otherwise. And so we talk about how the fact that there are moments in your life that are private, right? Sometimes you need a private moment to just be by yourself. Certainly if you're changing clothes or doing things like that, those are private moments and those happen behind closed doors. If you are ever in a moment that feels private, your device has no place there. And so that's one of the tips that we help, try to help our kids understand. And the other thing that is important to know when it comes to being alert is when I hear parents and teachers sometimes talking to kids about staying safe online, it's frankly, it's a little bit selfish, the conversation, right? It's like, you watch out, make sure you don't get in trouble, make sure you don't give your personal information, which is all true. But what I wish the conversation was saying, and how do you help create a safe space for others? So there's some data that they include in the book where, almost all kids, a huge number of kids, it's near 90% of kids, have seen some sort of bullying or harassment or, inappropriate behavior in a virtual space. And almost all of them report, this is from a Pew Internet study, most of them report having seen it and doing nothing about it. Because we have said, watch out for yourself, watch your back, but we haven't said, here's what you do when you see something where somebody else is being picked on or being, acting in an inappropriate way. And the cool part of this, though, is there's also data that shows that if somebody else intervenes, right? So somebody's picking somebody online and somebody else intervenes, even just as much as saying, hey, stop it, or leave my friend alone, that is almost enough. That is, in many cases, is enough to stop the bullying, right? So we talk about all the cyberbullying and the worries about it, but the fact of the matter is, it will stop if we have people that are just willing to intervene in some not very difficult ways. But that's the conversation that we have not had. We said, watch out for yourself, but we haven't said, what do you do when you see somebody else that's being picked on? How do you get involved? And that's what it means to be alert in a virtual space.
I love it. If you're listening to the podcast version, you're missing me shaking my head yes, because I agree with this. I mean, two very important things that you just mentioned: the fact that nothing on electronics is private.
Right.
You know, we didn't, you know, as we were doing things as teenagers or in high school, we didn't have somebody following us around with a camera. This stuff
Yep.
lives out there forever, and that's something we just haven't had to think about or talk about in the past. And so
Yeah.
this is an important conversation to have. And then the second piece that you mentioned, you know, there's a couple of extremes there. There's parents that are just kind of like letting the technology babysit the kids, and they're like not having any, you know, interaction at all. Or the other side where they're like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And I love the fact that you're giving, there's a learning opportunity there. You're giving them the opportunity to create these safe spaces, an answer to cyberbullying, for them to actually intervene and do something, to be empowered to say something and to take action there. I love it. We are actually right at, we could keep going on forever. We are right here at the end of the show. And so Richard, the book, Digital for Good, I think out the green screen is blacking it out there, but I've got my reader's copy here. For listeners who want to find out more, where can they go to find out more about you, about your company, and about the book?
Yeah, so easily, if you want to learn more, just go to innovativelearning.com. Innovativelearning.com will tell you a bit about the book, a little more about why I wrote it, and some of the projects that I'm involved in. And then, of course, if you're interested in buying a copy of the book, that's available on Amazon, but also at local bookstores around the country. So please feel free to learn more by picking up a copy.
Perfect. Last question I have for you. Is there anything I forgot to ask you that you'd like to leave the listeners with today?
You know, let me just, it's not that you, I don't know that you forgot to ask because you asked great questions, but I'll just leave maybe a final thought here, which is I am incredibly optimistic about the future of our world and the future digital world. I think there's so much good that we can do, and I think we can become really better humans because of the technology. But it will only happen if we are thoughtful and thoughtfully preparing our kids to use technology in really meaningful ways. If we stay hands off, if we just only list the don'ts and we aren't engaged in modeling this behavior, I'm really worried. I'm really worried about our future. But if we can just provide just a bit of structure and some guidelines, some boundaries, help provide some modeling, we're going to see kids do amazing things with technology that we could never have even dreamed of.
I love it. I love it. Richard, thank you so much for being with us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon there.
Chris, great talking to you. Thanks so much.